you all back again. Thank you for coming to round 3. I again am Andrew Packman, and I am married to your pastor, but I also teach on this stuff, race and religion, at United, which is my real reason for being here. And so I want to get started kind of quickly today because we've got a lot to cover. For those who have been, is this coming through okay?
Yeah.
Okay. For those who have been here since week 1, you know that each of these sessions kind of builds on the previous one. So the first class was about the idea of race, where that came from. We didn't always think about people and people groups in racial terms. And I argued that it was invented at a certain time in history for a purpose, namely to justify how we can at once say that we believe in the equal value of every human and go about this business of enslavement and colonialism. And the question then is if this isn't natural or inborn, if this is an idea that came out of somewhere and didn't have any basis in reality, how did they get to be so salient so that it determines our bank accounts and our property values and even how we see one another? And so the second session and today are telling the history of that emergence, where the idea of race became embedded and instilled in the very water we drink. And that started last week with a very long story of America's history with enslavement and the long process towards equality, at least legally. And today we move into the covert period. So racism, once it's no longer the law of the land, but is gone underground. And so hopefully this will bring the conversation a little bit closer to home for us. We're kind of leaving the agrarian South and moving up into the industrial North this week. And that will set us up for next week when we look at some of my own research on implicit bias, where race isn't just in the South, it's not just in the North, it's in our very perceptual and affective capacities. So, a quick review of last week. We've covered about 350 years of U.S. history, from the first slave ships landing in 1619 in Virginia to the civil rights reforms of the 1960s. And the main takeaway was that even though the Declaration of Independence said that these were self-evident truths, that all men are created equal and entitled to inalienable rights, the practice of enslaving black people had been legally accepted in all 13 colonies for 150 years before Jefferson wrote those words. Even after we declared independence, it took another 90 years and a civil war for enslaved persons to be legally freed. And even once black people were legally freed by the Constitution, and even once they were made U.S. citizens, and even once they had a constitutional amendment protecting the right to vote, it took another 100 years beyond that for these civil rights to be actually protected. This meant we've come a long way in race relations over the last 400 years, but I noted that each moment of progress was bound up with these intense moments of racial backlash, white racial backlash. And in order to avoid telling an overly rosy story of racial progress, we should remember that all of these gains that happened from 1865 to the 1960s were supposed to be the self-evident rights and entitlements of black people from the very beginning, according to the Constitution. So this story has an important lesson about both the importance and the limits of the law in achieving racial justice. It's one thing for Congress to pass laws that say enslaved black people are free. It's quite another thing for people who have been enslaved for 10 generations, who have no money and no land and no educational facilities that will let them in, no ability to read because it was illegal to teach them to read, for those folks to become actually free, to not still be under the thumb of those people who had previously enslaved them. So the changes in the law were vitally important, but it doesn't magically erase all of that inequality that had built up for 10 generations or more. So this left us with the question of how do you repair 10 generations worth of what Lincoln called unrequited toil? What does American redemption look like such that racial equality might actually become a self-evident truth? So that was last week, briefly. And it was important because if not for chattel slavery and the black codes and the Jim Crow era, we wouldn't have the enduring racial inequalities we have. But it would be a mistake to think that racism only existed in the period that existed before the civil rights movements. There was a popular myth that racism was a problem in the US long ago when slavery was legal and when schools and drinking fountains were legally segregated, but that the civil rights movement fixed it all so that we now live in a kind of post-racial or colorblind society. This myth is appealing because it demonizes those bad racists in the South who burned crosses and lynched black people, and in so doing it averts our gaze from the racism that is much more recent and unfortunately much closer to home. So this morning, as I said, we're moving out of the South and into the North in the era following the civil rights movement. Explicitly racist attitudes were on the decline, and northern cities like Chicago and Minneapolis that never had black codes or Jim Crow laws on the book will become our focus today. And the thesis here is that while racism took a different form here in the North, it was still racism. So, a few words to set us up. This graph tracks racial attitudes in the US from the early 20th century, about the 1930s, to 2015. And whether subjects were asked about their support for integrating schools or their support for racially mixed marriages, the rates of personal racial prejudice have dropped significantly over the last 100 years. So the green line says support for integrated schools amongst white respondents. The yellow line is opposition to laws that prohibit interracial marriage. And the blue line shows approval of interracial marriage. And so you can see that if you looked at these statistics and tried to make sense of how is America feeling about race these days, how are white people feeling about race, that things look to be getting better. In the late 1950s, something like 5% of white people approved of interracial marriage. But by the 2010s, over 85% of whites approved. This is a sea change in racial attitudes, and it means that the explanation for how these racial disparities continue to persist has to change too. Why, if white people are so much less racist today, at least in our hearts, than we were in the 1930s, do we still have this immense wealth gap? Which I've shown this map before, or this chart, and it shows that white people still have 10 times the wealth on aggregate of the average black man. So there's all this improvement in attitudes, but there's still persisting inequalities. To understand this, we have to track the way in which racism went underground in the mid-20th century and became covert. So what used to be visible to the naked eye now requires statistical analysis to be revealed. And there are thousands of books written on this topic by sociologists, and they chart these patterns in detail. And we could have chosen any one of them for this class, but I thought we would pick one particular way in which racism went underground, literally into our own backyards, as a kind of example of this larger trend that we could chart in healthcare, in education, and many others. So the case of housing in Chicago, which is what we'll look at today, is not unique. These practices happened all throughout the industrial North in the middle 20th century. But these dynamics were particularly severe in Chicago, and there's lots of data on it, and it's a context I know pretty well because I lived there and was doing research when I lived in Chicago. So I do want to stress that this is just one example, but we could find parallels likely here, but in many cities in the North. So to begin this story, we need to start where we left off last time in the Deep South. We saw that even after the end of slavery, the South remained an awful place to be black. Black people had good reason to want to get out of the South, and millions did. Between 1916 and 1970, some 6 million black people moved from the South to the industrial North to find a better life. This marked one of the largest and most rapid mass migrations in U.S. history. Before 1910, every U.S. census showed that over 90% of black people lived in the South, but by 1970, only about half of black people in the U.S. lived in the South. The rest had moved to urban centers, largely in the Midwest and the Northeast. The Great Migration, as it's called, is why there are such significant black populations in cities like Detroit, Minneapolis, Cleveland, and Chicago. As the US became an industrial power, the factories in these cities needed cheap labor, and black people in the South were eager for better pay and a better life. So this fundamentally changed the demographics of northern cities. During the 1920s, the black population of Chicago more than doubled, and then between 1940 and 1960, it tripled. Unfortunately, the black people making this migration were met with violence on both ends. As black people started to leave the South, white Southerners did nearly everything they could to keep them from leaving. Why? Because they wanted their cheap labor source to remain in place. They stationed police officers at railway stations who would confiscate the tickets of black people who had saved enough to finally afford a train ticket out. Southern states passed laws prohibiting northern companies from sending labor recruiters to the South to lure these black workers away. And there were plenty of cases where white mobs resorted to physical violence to intimidate black people from making this already very arduous journey north. But things weren't all peaches and cream when black people arrived in Chicago either. Many in the first wave of the Great Migration found jobs that had been previously held by white people who had gone off to fight in World War I. Of course, there were black soldiers in World War I too. But when these white people returned from war to find a more competitive labor market, they were less than pleased. In the Chicago race riot of 1919, so this is just on the backside of World War I, white workers in the meatpacking industry and in the stockyards on the south side, most of whom were recent immigrants from Ireland and Lithuania and Poland, rampaged through black neighborhoods in the south side of Chicago. They destroyed black homes and attacked black people, killing 38, injuring 500, and leaving over 1,000 black families homeless in the aftermath. In addition to violence, black people faced all kinds of other hurdles on their way to their new Chicago home. They were excluded from labor unions. This meant that they were frequently hired as scabs, that is, hired by factory owners to replace striking white workers, which built resentment between white workers and black ones. Furthermore, the black people who moved to Chicago from the South were prohibited from living outside of a carefully defined black belt on the city's south side. Now, I know some of you, I've had conversations with folks who are from Chicago, so this map will make some sense to you, but I'll try to describe it to the rest who don't know the city so well. The black belt here was the predominantly black neighborhood that at the turn of the 20th century ran along State Street through the south side of town from 22nd to 31st Street, so it was just 9 blocks north to south. But by mid-century, it would expand all the way up to 12th Street and down to 79th. These are all black families moving from the south that are building out this so-called black belt. When black people moved to Chicago, this is where they went. Now, in some ways, this sounds a lot like the Irish in Canaryville, or the Ukrainians in Ukrainian Village, or the Italians in the heart of Chicago, or Greeks in Greektown, and the Czechs in Pilsen. These are all ethnic enclaves. Different ethnic groups tend to stick together when they move to a new place. The same thing happens in New York and elsewhere. But the Black Belt in Chicago was different. That's because it wasn't an ethnic enclave, it was a ghetto. Now the difference here is important. We've already talked about the differences between ethnic groups and racial groups. This is now further distinction between ethnic enclaves and ghettos. Ethnic enclaves are sections of town where new immigrants typically choose to move because they share a common language, a common religion, common rituals and holidays, etc. What people living in a ghetto share is a lack of alternatives. The word ghetto comes from the Italian word, which was used to refer to a part of Venice where Jews were forced to live in the late medieval, early modern period. Like Venetian Jews, black people in Chicago didn't choose to live in the Black Belt, they were forced to live there. White people of all different ethnicities refused to allow black people to move into their neighborhoods and devised all manner of ways to prevent it. So part of what the story of today is to talk about how these methods of exclusion were enforced legally and extra-legally. The central mechanism for confining black people to the Black Belt was an instrument called restrictive covenants. This is a term that folks in the Twin Cities know too. There's been lots of research on Properties that still have these covenants kind of indexed to them. I believe the home we live in did have one, but it's been expunged. And there's been a process of trying to expunge these, which are no longer legally binding, but are a stain on the properties that many of us inhabit. So, what were these? Neighborhood associations devised agreements that were legally binding at the time, and that prohibited the renting or selling of property to black families. Property owners associations used similar tactics. So in the Hyde Park neighborhood in Chicago, which is where the University of Chicago is, it's an upper, racially mixed, but it's an upper class neighborhood. They even had a manual that prevented banks from offering loans to black people, prevented black people from renewing existing mortgages and leases, and even strong-armed hotels in Hyde Park until they agreed not to hire black people unless they lived in the black belt. Some of these associations also resorted to violence, and there's lots of evidence of white mobs forming at the doorstep of any black family who dared to purchase or rent a home in an otherwise white neighborhood. The de facto rule set by the Chicago Real Estate Board was that the only properties that black people were allowed to purchase outside of the black belt had to be adjacent to the black belt. So that meant that the black ghetto expanded at a snail's pace while the flow of new migrating families from the South kept pouring in. And so to cram more and more people in, landlords gutted old buildings and broke them up, partitioned them into even smaller units made with awful materials. And there were rarely any penalties for white landlords who ignored the building codes that were on the books, and this all produced what would become overcrowded slums. In just 1 year, there were 750 fires in the Black Belt, and tuberculosis infections were rampant in the early 20th century. This all changed in 1948 when the Supreme Court ruled that restrictive covenants were unconstitutional. This meant that those neighborhood agreements not to sell or rent to black people could not be enforced, and the central mechanism for keeping white neighborhoods white was suddenly gone. So, white people in Chicago and elsewhere responded by getting out of town. Between 1950 and 1956, so 6 years, 270,000 white Chicagoans left. During the same period, some 300,000 new housing units were built in the suburbs. This meant, for the first time, that black people could purchase homes in neighborhoods that they never thought they could. It was constitutionally protected now not to prevent them from moving into these neighborhoods. But there were still barriers to moving to the suburbs. Between 1946 and 1963, only 9 black families moved into previously all-white suburbs in Chicago. That is 9 families in 17 years, from the Truman to the Kennedy administration. Over about the same time, 688,000 new houses were built in Chicagoland, and of those, 77% were built out in the suburbs. White flight, perhaps more than any other social event in the last half century, has come to determine the present racial disparities in Chicagoland. So the question is, why is that? Blockbusting is one answer. Blockbusting was a scheme devised by real estate agents and speculators in the 50s and 60s to profit off of these racial anxieties. So the way it works is that an agent would show up at the door of a white family's home and tell them that black folks are starting to move into the neighborhood and that this was going to decimate their property values. So the agent, having just stoked this fear, would then offer them a way out. He would offer to purchase the home at a price well below market rates, so that the white family could at least get something out of this investment before the whole neighborhood went to hell. Lots of white people took them up on it. Some of them might have been truly afraid of living next to black people, but many others, I suspect, had not so much racist motives as they simply didn't want to see their house value plummet. Who would rationally want to see their nest egg all of a sudden become nearly worthless? It seemed to them like the rational, reasonable thing to do. So once the agent purchased the home, he would then turn around and sell it well above market rate to poor black families who were eager to get out of these ghettos and into historically more socially elite neighborhoods. middle-class neighborhoods. But of course, most black people couldn't afford to buy these expensive middle-class homes, largely on the west side of Chicago. So the agents would sell them these homes on contract. This is what we would now call predatory lending. It effectively removes all the risk from the seller and places all the responsibilities on the buyer. In these agreements, the seller gets to keep the deed until the contract is fully paid. The buyer makes a down payment and then pays monthly installments, but they develop no equity in the home until the contract is paid in full. During that time, the buyer assumes all responsibilities that go with owning a home. If a furnace breaks or a roof needs to be replaced, it's on the buyer to fix it. Now, this sounds like a bad idea. It gets worse. If the buyer misses even one single payment, perhaps because they had to fix the roof or buy a new furnace, they lose everything. They have no equity. They lose all their monthly payments. They lose their own down payments. They lose the house itself and any maintenance that they poured into it. They are simply put out onto the street by the end of the next month. Once a family wasn't evicted, the agent was then free to find another poor black family and set up the very same arrangement with them. This cycle meant that the middle-class residences on the west side of Chicago, in neighborhoods like North Lawndale, where the Sears Roebuck headquarters was, or Garfield Park, quickly fell into disrepair. If you were to drive through Chicago's west side today, you would see largely dilapidated neighborhoods because of this effect. And it's not that all black people who live there don't like nice things or that they don't want to take care of their homes. It's that this practice of buying on contract made it totally irrational for people to invest in keeping up homes that they didn't own and that they could lose at the drop of a hat. Buying on contract made it irrational for people to sink money into a new roof or landscaping or to repair a home's infrastructure. And yet, between the 30s and the 60s, 85% of black home buyers who bought in Chicago bought on one of these contracts. So I'm trying to show ways in which it's rational for white people in such a situation to move out, because economically rational, that is. It makes sense to get out before the neighborhood collapses, and for black families, it becomes irrational to invest in these homes because they're not really yours, and you can lose everything if you just miss one payment. So this is a way in which rationality itself gets shaped by a history of racism. So if buying on contract sounds like a terrible deal, it clearly was. So why then did so many black families choose to do so? The short answer is, again, that they didn't have other options. The normal 30-year mortgage that many of us have was not a live option for black people. Before the 30s, banks tended to issue mortgages with at most a 10-year term. This meant that people who wanted to buy a home needed to make a huge down payment so that they could pay it off in a relatively short time, 10 years. Most people didn't have the money for a down payment, and those who did often couldn't afford the steep rates that the banks offered. But all of this changes in the 1930s with the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation that would eventually turn into the Federal Housing Administration. These government institutions backed private mortgages with federal money so that banks could now offer the famous 30-year mortgage. They would draw out the term so that monthly outlay would decrease. And now homeowners could put as little as 10% down and get mortgage rates that were much lower than before. And this led to a massive increase in American homeownership. In the 1930s, only about 30% of Americans owned their homes, and this doubled by 1960. So over 60% of Americans by the Kennedy administration owned their homes, or at least were on a path to owning it. This should have meant that the black families moving into the west side of Chicago could easily afford one of these normal 30-year mortgages. So why did they choose to buy on contract instead? The answer, as this map indicates, is redlining. When the federal government decided to insure these private mortgages, they drew up a system of maps that rated neighborhoods based on their perceived stability. They were color-coded, where green areas indicated that a neighborhood was in demand, Yellow ones meant that it was borderline, and red ones meant the neighborhood was undesirable. And you can kind of see here, here's the lakeshore on the east side of town, and there's this little green strip along the Gold Coast and into Lincoln Park. This is where it's still very beautiful and lovely, and lots of white people live. And then further away from the Lake Michigan, deeper into town, you can see lots of red spaces where predominantly black families lived. So these red-lined neighborhoods were ineligible for FHA insurance. The federal government simply would not back loans on these properties. Neighborhoods that had even one black family living in them were immediately prohibited from getting a green coloration. In fact, to get a green designation, one appraiser said that it could not have even a single foreigner or Negro. If that was the case for neighborhoods with only one black family, this meant that predominantly black neighborhoods were entirely marked red. As such, they were categorically excluded from receiving these new 30-year mortgages that were backed by federal dollars. So black families bought on contract because they lived in red-lined neighborhoods and couldn't get normal loans from normal banks. Their only option were these predatory lenders who were making money hand over fist by exploiting these racial tensions. So this is a map, I believe, from the 30s or 40s. And this shows a progression over time. So this is racial breakdowns in the city of Chicago, racial density in 1950, 1970, 1990, and 2010. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made this practice of redlining illegal. So whole neighborhoods could no longer be cut out from federally subsidized mortgages. This was a good thing. It stopped the bleeding. But of course didn't repair the wrongs that had happened for the previous 30 plus years. It didn't magically increase the property values on the south and west side that had already crashed through the floor. It didn't magically return the down payments and the monthly payments that had been swindled out of black people's hands by white realtors. It didn't magically make up for decades of disinvestment and dilapidated houses left in the wake of these racist housing real estate practices. So the maps here show the racial breakdown of Chicago neighborhoods from, as I said, 1950, 70, 90, and 2010. Red marks neighborhoods where persons of color are in the majority. Blue marks white majority neighborhoods. And the white color marks racially mixed neighborhoods. So the supposedly free market does not seem to apply to the housing market here, where movement is continuing to be restricted by these racist patterns that developed. And if you compare these maps that show the percentage of vacant with those that show the percentage of vacant homes and unemployment levels, they map almost perfectly over these predominantly non-white neighborhoods here in red. So this last map from 2010 is over 40 years after the practice of redlining was made illegal, and yet the effects remain very much intact. So redlining systematically excluded black people on the south side and west side from access to federally subsidized mortgages. So instead of building equity and wealth, the little wealth that they had was largely siphoned off into the hands of these white real estate agents and investors who peddled these predatory loans. But this meant that almost all of the federally subsidized mortgages issued between the 30s and the 60s went exclusively to white people. In fact, 98% of FHA loans went to white families at that time. This means that when white people fled Chicago en masse in the 50s and 60s, they were able to buy homes in the suburbs, and they built over 300 new homes, largely because they had access to government subsidies from which black people were excluded systematically. Without government intervention into the mortgage industry, the huge increase in homeownership between 1930 and 1960 would have been impossible. And yet, because this government intervention was racist, it meant that the largest housing boom in American history was almost exclusively for white people. So there are really 2 points to be made here. First, the west side of Chicago and the west suburbs, amongst other suburbs, are two sides of the same coin. where the West Side saw government disinvestment that generated lower property values and lower rates of homeownership in black neighborhoods, the West Suburbs saw government investment and generated higher property values and higher rates of homeownership in white neighborhoods. The second point is just as interesting to me. The housing boom that enriched white families was the product of government intervention. The federal government drew up these racist redlining maps that prevented the flow of credit into black neighborhoods and redirected it into white ones. Of course, today there is strong resistance in the US to anything that reeks of government intervention or the redistribution of wealth. But the irony here is that those who denounce this investment or intervention from the government in the free market were not all that long ago the recipients of just such government intervention. This redistribution of wealth would have profound consequences. How many times have you heard someone say that we used to live in the city, but moved to the suburbs because of the schools? That's usually up there with safety and more space as the primary reasons why people find the suburbs so appealing. Public schools are primarily funded through property taxes, and property taxes are indexed to property values. So richer areas have a much larger tax base from which to fund local schools than do poor ones. Now, money isn't everything in education, but it's certainly something. And if suburban property values are inflated and urban property values are depressed because of history of racist housing policies, what do you do? Another major consequence has to do with our nest eggs. For most Americans, the most significant investment we make is in our homes. So long as property values increase over time, homes are reasonably safe as ways to build a family's wealth from one generation to the next. This wealth becomes generational. Because my grandparents owned a home, they were able to provide for my parents. My parents' first down payment on a home came from money that my mom inherited from a deceased relative. And then when my wife and I, Sarah, you know Sarah, went to buy our first home in the west suburbs of Chicago, we received a sizable gift from one of her relatives, a grandmother, that would help us to make our down payment. This produces a snowball effect. Today, the median value of white households is approximately 20 times that of black households. 15% of whites have zero or negative wealth, where more as 33% of blacks have zero or negative wealth. This is in part what has led to the massive racial wealth gap in the US, where the median net worth of a white family is 10 times that of a median black family. And according to Lily Batchelder, a professor at NYU, this is a shocking statistic. The largest wealth transfer in the history of the world is currently underway. Baby boomers and the generation that precedes them hold some 81% of the entire household wealth in the US, some $84 trillion. White families are twice as likely to receive an inheritance as are black families. And receiving an inheritance leads to an increase in wealth that is 26 times larger for white families than it is for black ones. So if the US inheritance law remains as they are today, this transfer of $84 trillion of household wealth will further cement and worsen the racial gap that we've already seen here. This is going to further entrench it and likely make it worse. Okay. So, I'm an ethicist. Let's talk about the morals of this. Once we know that the role racism has played in housing in Chicagoland and other cities too, our moral situation gets more complex. Consider the good schools problem. Suppose you currently live in a trendy, racially diverse neighborhood in Chicago or here that you love, but the public school district you're in has a low ranking. And so you're considering a move to a mostly white suburb with really good public schools. By all means, this is a perfectly rational decision to want good education for your kids. In fact, it is our responsibility as parents to ensure that our kids are well educated. It'll open the world to them. And it will also help ensure that they get into a good college and hopefully a good job that can support themselves. And yet, because we live in a world created by these racist policies of the past, where good schools are largely in wealthy white communities and bad ones in poor communities of color, this seemingly innocent, even responsible decision to put our kids in the best schools we can effectively further segregates our neighborhoods and our schools. In this case, good intentions and rational choices lead to further racial disparities. This is what I mean about racism becoming covert, that even doing the right thing for yourself and your kids can end up furthering these divides that we all say we abhor. Or consider the decision faced by those white homeowners on Chicago's West Side in the 50s. Some real estate agent comes to tell you that the value of your home is going to drop by 30%, even by the next month, if you don't sell right now. No one wants to take a 30% haircut on their largest nest egg investments. It's perfectly reasonable and even responsible to take this offer and go. This decision isn't necessarily based on any feelings of prejudice towards black families who are planning to move in next door. You might even want to get to know these black families and desire a more racially diverse neighborhood. And yet, because we're living in a world shaped by these policies that I've been outlining, the economics of the situation are clear. And this means that even unintentionally, the family that moves out contributes to the greatest transfer of wealth in American history. Or to bring it into the present, all you have to do is obey current US inheritance law. Just go with the flow and you will participate in extending and exacerbating this wealth gap. This is a tragedy. The tragedy of our situation is you don't have to be racist to contribute to school segregation. You just have to be a normal person who wants good things for your kids. Or a normal person who doesn't want to lose an arm and a leg from your family's nest egg. Or a normal person who wants to pass on the wealth that you've accumulated to the next generation. When we talk about institutional or systemic racism, this is what we're talking about. You don't need a racist bone in your body to contribute to these racial injustices. We contribute to them just by making rational, apparently innocent decisions for ourselves and for our kids. Right, so to conclude, a couple upshots. Racial inequalities endure long after declines in explicit racial prejudice. All of this stuff happened during the period when all of those racial attitudes were improving over the 20th century. Second, to inherit a world that is shaped by a history of racism means that even innocent, seemingly responsible decisions can further entrench these inequalities. Third, the suburbs are inextricably related to the city. And fourth, white people didn't get rich on our own and black people didn't get poor on their own. That these movements of wealth and property are related to each other. Right, I will take a breath. It's a lot of policy and kind of boring government stuff, but I hope you see the kind of larger trends that I'm trying to outline are the ways that actually our own personal moral decisions that we make all the time have impacts that outstrip what we typically see. Now we need these sociological studies, these economists to show how these choices actually reap effects that we don't intend to even bring them into view. So I would love to